Plans to allow all schools in England to apply to select pupils by ability. The Prime Minister says along with new grammars, it'll boost poorer children's chances.
I want to see children from ordinary working class families given the chances their richer contemporaries take for granted.
But there's significant opposition, not least from the government's own Inspector of Schools.
My fear about this is that we'll create again grammar schools for the few and secondary moderns for the many.
We'll be looking at how the plans might work and whether they're likely to win sufficient support. Also tonight, the British-Iranian woman jailed for 5 years in Iran. Her husband says she's not been told why.
You know, it's just crazy by any legal system, and it just, you know, it's a punishment without a crime. It just looks nonsense.
3 women arrested in Paris over a suspected terror plot were directed by so-called IS, say French authorities.
You can see it's 22 minutes past 9.
The groundbreaking robotic surgery restoring sight where it couldn't be done before.
New Paralympic record, 102.4.
And the golds keep coming for Para-GB as world records tumble in Rio.
In the south, why health officials are defending plans to close down a number of GP surgeries in Dorset. And could a new design win over those concerned about the tallest apartments in Berkshire?
Good evening. All schools in England should be able to apply to select pupils by ability. That's the proposal from Theresa May, part of her plans for a huge shake-up in education with a new generation of selective schools and grammar schools. She also stipulated that the new grammars would have to take children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But her proposal will face strong opposition from much of the teaching profession and from within her own party. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
All change in English schools, that's the plan. All schools free to seek to become grammars. The biggest and most controversial shake-up in decades. The grammar school educated PM is going further than any leader's gone before.
Politicians, many of whom benefited from the very kind of education they now seek to deny to others, have for years put their own dogma and ideology before the interests and concerns of ordinary people. For we know that grammar schools are hugely popular with parents. We know they are good for the pupils that attend them. So we help no one, not least those who can't afford to move house or pay for a private education, by saying to parents who want a selective education for their child that we won't let them have it.
What about children from poorer homes who don't often get into grammar schools? What about schools like this, Inner London Comprehensive? She insisted no one would be left behind. Britain hadn't just voted out of the EU, people wanted a fairer deal.
They want change, and this government is going to deliver it. Everything we do will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, not by those with the loudest voices, the special interests, the greatest wealth or the access to influence. This government's priorities are those of ordinary working class people.
The Prime Minister said new grammars would have to reserve places for disadvantaged children. There'd be new entrants at 14 and 16. They would also have to offer help to local non-selective schools. She said independent fee-paying schools must offer more in return for their tax breaks. They'd have to give help to state schools or sponsor them. The same for universities if they want to raise their fees. They'll have to sponsor new schools or help underperforming ones. And Mrs May wants to relax restrictions on faith schools. If they're oversubscribed, they'll no longer have to offer half their places to children from outside their faith.
Today you say there should be more academically elite state grammar schools, which means more talent drawn away from non-selective schools, and it means the losers who do not get into these schools are denied those opportunities with the greater sense of unfairness and injustice that causes. Are those fair points?
It's not fair today when some children are able to get into a good school purely because their parents are able to buy the house that sits next to that school. So there are too many children in our society today who are not getting access to a good school education.
The plan went down badly at this comprehensive.
What we're going to see is true, genuine mixed schools like this suffer This stall does a great job by all children, most able, least able and middle ability children. By taking one group out of schools like this are going to battle to survive.
The man in charge of monitoring English school standards isn't convinced either.
The comprehensive system is working. The academy movement, the free school movement, greater autonomy for schools, better governance is working, and it needs time to bed in. And my fear is that this will throw a spanner in the works and slow that momentum down.
Theresa May doesn't see politics or big changes in policy as an ideological game with rival theories batted backwards and forwards. She's interested in what works, and creating a school system with more winners without creating more losers certainly fits her idea of a fairer Britain after Brexit. Trouble is, her critics don't believe it can be done, and tearing up decades of political consensus, well, that can't be done without a fight.
The MP Theresa May sacked as Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, posted her view of the plan on social media. She said, identifying areas of poor education and lack of good schools is right. Idea that more selection is the answer is wrong.
I want good education for every child. Selectivity at 11 divides communities, divides children, and ends up giving a good chance to a minority and a less chance to the majority. I don't think that's a very sensible way forward for our country.
The PM's old school has changed, a grammar no longer, but its most illustrious old pupil came away with a clear conviction. What worked for her can work for anyone, and she's sticking to it. John Pienaar, BBC News.
Well, the proposals announced by Mrs May apply only to England, but the picture around the rest of the UK varies widely. In Northern Ireland, nearly half of all pupils go to grammar schools, but in Scotland and Wales, there are none. Our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, reports now from two very different parts of Greater Manchester: Tameside, which doesn't have grammar schools, and Trafford, which does.
Educating the girls of Altrincham for 100 years. A third of pupils in Trafford go to grammar schools now. So how in this leafy area can they be open to all?
With the right circumstances, then all the children can flourish.
The head teacher tells me they've started a quota system, setting aside some places for poorer families.
We can't change where we are. We are here in Altrincham, we can't change that. We wouldn't want to change that. But that doesn't mean that we can't work with schools in other parts of Manchester to make sure that all of us provide the best possible education we can for our students.
The lessons learnt here are being shared. This school is part of a group which includes comprehensives. So grammar schools argue that they are already changing, that they're no longer just about improving the life chances of the privileged few. Schools like this are reaching out to others in deprived areas and working with them to raise standards across the education system. But look at grammar schools across England, and just 3% of pupils are entitled to free school meals. In nearby non-selective schools, it's 18%. And 13% of grammar school pupils come from independent schools. In Altrincham, most pupils also need to live nearby to get in streets of smart houses and clipped hedges. No surprise, this is called a social mobility hotspot. Trafford is at the top end of good places to grow up, better chances of going to university, getting a well-paid job. Travel to the other side of Manchester and it's a different story. Tameside is what's called a social mobility cold spot in the bottom 10%. That's not just down to education, but jobs and health too.
Right then, back to the kitchen. Now you guys can eat any leftovers.
Primary school is all about letting your imagination fly. Audenshaw Primary School is in an area not rich, not poor. Kids go on to local high schools, one good, one struggling.
Our motto is putting children first, regardless of ability.
But like many teachers, the head here is uneasy about selection.
You bring them in, you nurture them, you get to know the parents, we get to know all the parents in school. And that, to me, is what education actually is about, getting to know the families and treating all the children as they are, regardless of ability.
Audenshaw is the kind of area where most parents go out to work, sometimes juggling 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. Just the kind of families that Theresa May wants to reach. So I asked some of the parents here what they made of the suggestion of new grammar schools.
I'm from round here and I went to this school, my children do, and all my family have done, and I think grammar schools are a good way forward, to be honest.
It doesn't fill me with confidence. I feel like children from all backgrounds and ages should be getting the same quality of education, regardless of ability.
Will this generation grow up with selection? There's a fund of £50 million to encourage it. But there are risks for existing grammars and their reputations. Risks too for academies who want to make progress in all their schools. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News, Tameside.
Well, let's go back to our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, who's at Westminster for us tonight. John, this is Theresa May's first big policy statement. It suggests huge change, which has taken many people by surprise, and she's likely to have a battle on her hands to get it through.
Yes, she is. There'll be trouble in Parliament, in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, which is a bit ironic when you consider that Theresa May owes part of her popularity to the perception of her as a force for stability in the turmoil after the EU referendum. Now we see today she's perfectly willing to take on big change, big policy challenges, even if it means a fight, and this will mean a fight. In the House of Commons, there'll be criticism from her own side as well as from the other parties. There's a tiny government majority there, remember. In the House of Lords, well, there'll be peers who hope they can stop this plan in its tracks. It was not spelled out in the Tories' election manifesto, which means there's no obligation on peers to respect this proposal. There will be a fight there too. But Theresa May sees this as part of her answer to the demand for change and fairness she sees as the backbeat to that European referendum campaign. And there's personal commitment too. She writes in tomorrow's Daily Mail newspaper of her time at grammar school and how those teachers there helped make her the woman that she is. Well, what we know about the woman that Theresa May is tells us that she is not about to back down from this position anytime soon.
John Pienaar at Westminster, thank you. The Foreign Office says it's deeply concerned about the fate of a British Iranian woman who's been sentenced to 5 years in prison in Iran. Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who's a charity worker, was detained in April while visiting her parents in Iran with her young daughter. Today it was revealed she's been convicted by a revolutionary court on charges which remain secret. Her British husband has been speaking to our correspondent Caroline Hawley.
Charity worker, mother, prisoner. Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe now faces 5 years in a high-security Iranian jail. She'd been visiting family with her young daughter Gabriella when she was arrested by Iran's Revolutionary Guards as they were returning to the UK. She was accused of trying to engineer the peaceful overthrow of the Islamic Republic. When her husband Richard was allowed to speak to her on the phone briefly this morning, he told me she didn't know the exact charges against her.
Why sentence someone for 5 years and then not say what you sentenced them for? That you know, is just crazy by any legal system, and it just, you know, it's a punishment without a crime. It just looks nonsense.
This is where she's being held. The prison is notorious in Iran. We spoke to someone who knows what it's like to be inside.
Evin prison has a history of executions, torture. Thousands of innocent lives perished in that prison. And for someone like her who has not had any prison experience, Evin prison, being in Evin prison is a real torture.
Iran's relations with the West have been steadily improving since a deal was struck on the country's nuclear programme. This was the reopening of the British Embassy last year, and earlier this week ties were upgraded to full diplomatic relations. Many believe Nazanin is a victim of infighting within the regime between hardliners and the moderate president Hassan Rouhani. Another victim, Gabriella Zaghari Ratcliffe, filmed here before her mother's arrest at her grandparents' house in Iran. She's now spent almost a quarter of her life separated from both parents. Nazanin told her husband she dreams of her daughter every night.
It's just horrendous, and she can't take more than another day of it. And yet is completely powerless to do anything.
Amnesty International has called the whole case against Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe a complete travesty of justice. The Foreign Office says it's deeply concerned. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Let's take a brief look at some of the day's other news stories. Police are looking into whether the Labour MP, Keith Vaz, committed any crimes following allegations about his private life. Mr Vaz resigned as chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee after a newspaper claimed he'd paid for the services of 2 male prostitutes. Thames Valley Police say they found the body of the last man missing after part of Didcot Power Station collapsed back in February. 4 men were killed in the incident. The body is believed to be that of John Shaw, who was 61 and from Rotherham. The US car company General Motors is recalling more than 4 million vehicles due to a software defect linked to at least 1 death. The company says the fault is rare but can prevent airbags from deploying in a crash. The majority of vehicles affected are in the United States. The 3 women arrested near Paris yesterday on suspicion of planning imminent terror attacks on the capital were being directed remotely by so-called Islamic State in Syria. That's according to the French prosecutor, who also revealed one of the women had been engaged to the extremist who killed a French priest in July. The women were detained after a car was discovered near Notre Dame Cathedral, packed with gas canisters. Our Paris correspondent Lucy Williamson has more.
This, say police, was the heart of a terrorist cell of 3 young women, controlled directly from Syria. Officers tracked them to this flat south of Paris, and yesterday evening, while still under cover, caught them as they emerged onto the street outside. In the chaos, the youngest, just 19 years old, stabbed an officer with a large kitchen knife and was shot in the legs. A witness captures the moment she's stretchered away. On her, police found a pledge to terrorise France in the name of so-called Islamic State. In Paris today, the chief prosecutor described the cell as a new kind of threat.
The actions of these young women, directed at a distance by IS members in Syria, show that this organisation wants to turn women into fighters.
This is the car left near Notre Dame last weekend, packed with gas canisters and a petrol-soaked blanket, but no detonator and no explosion. On one of the suspects, investigators say they found keys to the car that was abandoned here. Another, they say, had been romantically involved with some of the men who had carried out jihadist attacks in France this year. One of her former fiancés is said to be Adel Kamish, the teenager who killed a priest in Rouen less than 2 months ago. Speaking after the arrests last night, France's Interior Minister said the hunt for the women had been a race against time.
These women, aged 39, 23 and 19 years old, were radicalized and fanaticised and were planning new and imminent violent attacks.
More than 200 people have been killed in terrorist attacks across France over the past 2 years. Their killers studied for clues about this growing national threat. But their profile keeps changing. There are battle-hardened fighters and recent converts, immigrants and nationals, women and men. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
Surgeons in Oxford have used a robot to operate inside an eye, a world first. The patient was a 70-year-old man who had the vision in his right eye restored after the robot removed a membrane just 1/100 of a millimetre thick. The technology should mean that in future surgeons will be able to do more complex procedures that are currently possible. Our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh has this exclusive report.
Deterioration of sight in my right eye is progressive. Until now, it's really problematic.
Bill Beaver is going blind in one eye.
If for example, I take a book and I cover my left eye, which is still good, all I see is mush. Except
his central vision is completely gone. But that's about to change at Oxford's John Radcliffe Hospital. In theatre, the surgeon uses a joystick to move the robot arm, which has a thin needle attached. Robot-assisted surgery is now commonplace, especially in cancer operations, but this will be a world first. Never before has a robot been used to operate inside the eye. This is delicate surgery involving tiny, precise movements to remove a membrane which is causing Bill's sight loss. Crucially, the robot can filter out the surgeon's hand tremors. The robot has to pivot around a tiny hole in the wall of the eye. Inside, it removes a membrane just 1/100 of a millimetre thick, shown in blue, which is covering the retina, allowing the hole in the retina to close.
But if you could hold your watch face up, just put your head down.
Just a few days later, and the results are clear.
I can see it's 22 minutes past 9.
And before long, his distance vision will return to normal.
It's almost the world of fairy tales, but it's true. It's the difference between being active and doing the things I need to do and enjoying art and enjoying life.
The surgeon says the robot performed better than the human hand.
I think we're going to go into a new era of eye surgery where we're going to be placing things at the back of the eye under the retina very much more accurately and with much greater precision than we do at the moment. We can certainly improve on the current operations, but I very much hope that we can do new operations that currently we can't do with the human hand. We can now do them with the robot.
Diseases of the retina are the most common cause of blindness in the developed world. Robots should enable many more patients to have their sight saved. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
3 former Tesco senior executives has been charged with fraud and false accounting. It follows an investigation by the Serious Fraud Office after a black hole of more than £250 million was found in the supermarket's accounts 2 years ago. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson is here. Emma, this was a massive scandal for Tesco.
It really was. It plunged Tesco into turmoil, it stunned the city and wiped billions off the value of the company. Now, it's centred on how it had incorrectly recorded income from its suppliers, which boosted its profits. And today the SFO charged 3 men. Carl Rogberg, the former finance director for Tesco UK, who you can see there, John Schooler, Tesco's former UK commercial director for food, and the most senior of them all, Chris Bush, Tesco's former UK boss. They are all accused of fraud by abuse of position and a charge of false accounting. Now, Mr. Bush and Mr. Rogberg made statements through their lawyers today saying they weren't guilty and they would be vigorously contesting the allegations. As for Tesco, it said in a short statement that it continued to cooperate with the SFO and that it had made extensive changes over the last 2 years. In other words, this business is a very different one compared to its darkest days back in 2014. But could there be more to come? Because the SFO says its investigations into Tesco are ongoing.
Emma, thank you. There's been international outrage after North Korea carried out its 5th and reportedly biggest nuclear test. Kim Jong-un, the leader of the isolated communist regime, was described by the leader of South Korea as a reckless maniac. The UN Security Council has been holding an emergency meeting this evening. From South Korea, Steve Evans reports.
She's become a familiar face. The North Korean newsreader says the nuclear test will protect the country's dignity and existence. In South Korea, they monitored the tremors. Each test has been bigger than the one before. The device detonated this time is just short of the power of the Hiroshima bomb. From Japan today, planes took off to gather air samples to try to determine what kind of device was exploded. Condemnation has been swift.
We were gravely concerned by reports of a nuclear device being tested by North Korea. And this is a flagrant violation of Security Council resolutions, and it threatens the stability and security of that region.
The underground blast happened at this site in North Korea, only 9 months after the last nuclear test. Kim Jong-un is in a rush to fulfill his nuclear ambition. Yesterday in Pyongyang, the regime's leaders clapped in unison as the country celebrated the anniversary of its founding in 1945. For them, the bomb is the icing on the cake. Here tonight in Seoul, in South Korea, life goes on. People assume Kim Jong-un's bloodthirsty threats to turn the place into a heap of ashes will not happen, even though he's appeared alongside what he claimed was a nuclear warhead small enough to go on a rocket.
North Korea is just 50 kilometers from here, 30 miles, but it could be another world. The regime there is celebrating a great triumph tonight. Nobody knows what the people think, but there is no sign of that regime being close to collapse.
North Korea does not have nuclear-tipped missiles yet, but it's working steadily towards getting them. Stephen Evans, BBC News, Seoul.
Now, it was a trip up the highest mountain in the Alps that turned into a nightmare. Dozens of people were forced to spend up to 24 hours dangling precariously 12,000 feet above the ground after the cars became stuck. A helicopter managed to winch out some of those trapped to safety, but others were forced to spend the night in the cars before rescuers eventually managed to restart them and bring them safely back down. It's been a victorious day too for Britain's Paralympians in Rio. In the last hour, there's been another gold. This time, Jodie Cundy stormed to victory in his 1 kilometre time trial in the velodrome. Earlier, paracyclist Sophie Thornhill and Helen Scott won gold in their women's 1,000-metre time trial. From Rio, Andy Swiss has more.
Two riders, one common goal. At the back of the tandem, Sophie Thornhill, who's visually impaired, piloted by Helen Scott. Together, the perfect pedalling partnership. That made them the fastest so far in the time trial, but would anyone go faster? Well, when their last rivals failed to beat their time, they knew that gold was theirs. Cue unbridled joy as the velodrome once again echoed to British cheers. Yesterday, they'd been for this woman, Dame Sarah Storey, enjoying her record-breaking 12th Paralympic title. It was her first, though, with daughter Louisa, and she told me that made it particularly special.
Having Louisa here is just the icing on the cake. It doesn't get much better than having your kids to watch you win. And whether she remembers it or not, she's really excited to have the mascot. And there was never thought that I could leave her at home because she's included in everything we do. And that obviously is just fantastic to have her here.
In the athletics, meanwhile, there was a silver medal for long jumper Steph Reed, but success mingled with controversy. Visually impaired sprinter Libby Clegg setting a world record, only to be disqualified after it was ruled her guide runner had pulled her along. Britain appealed successfully though, and Clegg will compete in tonight's final. But the title of world's fastest Paralympian once again went to Ireland. Jason Smith has less than 10% vision, but he has maximum velocity. 10.64 seconds, Smith's third title in a row. And in the last hour, more British success. 4 years ago in London, Jodie Cundy was disqualified, prompting a furious and expletive-filled rant. This time, though, it was a ride of redemption, as Cundy conjured a blistering display. Gold at last, after the agony of London, victory in Rio. And just moments later, gold in the athletics. Georgie Hermitage, who has cerebral palsy, quit the sport as a teenager. But inspired by 2012, she returned, and this was her moment. A world record and tears of joy. And there was more. 19-year-old Sophie Hahn took up athletics after watching Johnny Peacock in London, and now she has her own title. 3 gold medals in 10 minutes for British sport some evening. And guess what? In the last few minutes, another gold medal in the swimming for 15-year-old Ellie Robinson, a schoolgirl from Northampton. Quite extraordinary. That makes it 10 gold medals in the first 2 days. It has been some start here for the British team, Fiona.
Congratulations to them all. Andy, thanks very much. That's all from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.